There seems to be a growing number of people who are unvaccinated who are refusing blood transfusions. And this article here recently, and this is from March 31st, 2026, noted that more people requesting unvaccinated blood for themselves or their children. And this seems to be a growing issue for which the medical community doesn't have any sensible answers. To be frank, what has happened is that they have largely ignored the question and consider it to just be ridiculous. Now, I was going to tackle this previously, but I thought carefully about it and decided to look around the science. But then something caught my attention, and it was in a conversation with Dr. Shankara Shetty. And I'm going to share with you what he said, and I'll explain to you what then made me think we should definitely be looking at this in far more detail. Listen to this conversation with Dr. Shetty to get an insight into what he saw as a reality.
Just an example, I had a patient who refused the vaccine. She's been fine, had COVID 3 times, got over it, no issues at all. She had a shoulder problem and as well, I think over time, history of anemia. When she went in for the operation for her shoulder, they looked at her anemia and transfused her while she was on the table. And she went through the shoulder op, no issues, came out of hospital, and within a few days of being discharged, started feeling very unwell. When she presented to me after, I think, 3 days of her discharge, had swelling feet, had palpitations, had a fluctuant blood pressure, and it looked like she had developed myocarditis. So I was wondering, how did you develop myocarditis? What was I looked at the anesthetic she was given, all the kind of things to see there was no side effect from that. And we're all well aware of that. And the one thing that struck me, she was transfused. And of course, the blood services are not looking at whether it was from a vaccinated or unvaccinated patient. So I'm suspicious that she was just exposed to the vaccine through a transfusion, and that triggered the myocarditis. And I think I'm actually making an appointment for her to see the cardiologist. But how would a patient that goes through a simple operation, get a transfusion, end up with myocarditis? Now, if you're not having that at the back of your head, you're never going to figure that trigger out.
So that was the point that got me thinking, because I've learned that when Dr. Shetty notices something, don't ignore it. So I then started to think about it, because the natural thought these days is, was it specifically due to the vaccine? And I think that once you do that, you immediately go down a rabbit hole rather than looking a little bit broader. Okay, so it may be connected, but not directly. So I'm going to take you through what I thought about at that point with regards to what could be going on. Because what he noticed was that the person got on well within a few days of the procedure and the transfusion. So here is my analysis of what I think could be going on. So the first thing that you have to realize is that blood transfusions are quite important and significant actions, interventions that we do. We don't do it lightly. So the truth is if you are being suggested to have a blood transfusion, pretty good chance that you really need it. And the question is whether or not the risk outweighs the benefit, meaning that if you need blood and you are unwell, worrying about a potential spike exposure is a small risk compared to the benefit that you would get. That is one side of the puzzle, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a responsibility from the scientific and medical community to actually answer the concerns that the public has, even if you think it's a minority, about some of these issues. So follow along here. I actually think that what may have happened is a principle called alloimmunization. And I got this paper here to try and make sense of it. Reticulocytes in donor blood units enhance red blood cell alloimmunization. And this was a study that was done in 2023. And it's an important point about what these reticulocytes are and why there may be a connection. So reticulocytes are immature red blood cells. So when red blood cells are being formed in the bone marrow, some of them that come out of the bone marrow haven't yet been fully integrated into a red blood cell, and they still have pieces of maybe DNA or even mitochondria in them before they then become mature, because a red blood cell doesn't have any DNA, doesn't have any mitochondria, and it dies after about 120 days. But if there is a situation where there is a higher proportion of reticulocytes, it seems that there is a real risk. When we look at the paper here, they highlighted that early reticulocytes retain mitochondria and other components which may act as danger signals in immune responses. Herein, we tested whether reticulocytes in donor red blood cells could enhance red blood cell alloimmunization. And they did confirm that if you transfused reticulocyte rich red blood cell units, there was an association with increased red blood cell clearance from the circulation and a robust pro inflammatory cytokine response. The problem with this alloimmunization is that once it has happened, it predisposes the body to react in a similar way on further exposure. So it is relatively important and relatively serious in that sense. So where is the connection with regards to the pandemic? Now, this is where you have to follow along. When I looked carefully here, there's another paper. This was again in March of 2023, looking at iron dysregulation and inflammatory stress associated with long-term outcomes of COVID-19. So they are looking at changes in terms of long-term symptoms with regards to COVID. And they found a very important pattern. It's just that it seems that not the immune system, the red blood cells seem to be affected negatively in people who are having ongoing symptoms with regards to COVID. And when you look carefully at this, reticulocyte counts were elevated in people who had symptoms and those who didn't have symptoms groups compared to healthy cohorts at day 31 to 90, corresponding with the peak of the stress erythropoietic response. That means the red blood cell production. And so what this is indicating is that the same cells, reticulocytes, immature red blood cells, levels increase once people have had potential either exposure, longer term symptoms, or potentially even vaccination. It could impact on the hematopoiesis in the bone marrow, increasing reticulocytes. And if an individual blood was collected, there could be an increased risk of alloimmunization. Now, it's important to note that that is an extrapolation. It is speculation, so to speak, because there is no clear evidence that these two things are connected. Dr. Shetty noticed that his patient became unwell after surgery. It could have been related to surgery and the blood transfusion. Therefore, it doesn't mean necessarily that was the cause. However, without further investigation on these kinds of questions, we risk running into problems in the future. For me, I have listed here what is a plausible mechanism where blood products, because of increased reticulocytes that occur around exposure of the body to spike protein, could trigger abnormal immune responses on transfusions. I think that that alone is enough of a question for blood banks to look carefully at reticulocyte counts in the context of the blood that they have received. And if they find that people who have symptoms, or if there are any patterns that are associated with people who have higher reticulocyte counts in their blood products, maybe you don't want to take their blood and you want to be more cautious. And this is what I'm saying now, is that science needs to be released to ask the hard questions. There is no question in the scientific world that can be considered irrelevant. If you don't have an answer, you try and answer it, but you don't discount it because you think that it may be irrelevant. And so therefore, the concern that has been raised by people who were unvaccinated, that they are worried about blood for themselves or for their children, until the research has been done, you can't actually discount it completely. And I think that if you provide an answer that makes sense, and if you are able to reassure the public that, listen, spike protein is not a problem here, but we have identified something that could be relevant and needs to be taken into consideration for future management and blood transfusion, that is the way that science goes forward. So I hope you appreciate this kind of analysis. I'm stepping outside the box, but I do believe that once we start to see patterns, they should always be investigated, never ignored. Have a great evening.